when an arrogant cop tried flaunting his authority at Chuck Norris. He believed his badge made him invincible. But power, it blinds fools. Within moments, he was disarmed, humiliated, and handed a harsh lesson in respect by the last man you'd ever want to challenge. But before we jump in, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. It was a perfect spring afternoon in Los Angeles's Griffith Park, one of those days where everything just feels right with the world. Families were spreading out their picnic blankets on the lush, green grass, kids ran around chasing butterflies, and the air echoed with the sweet melody of birds chirping among the century-old oak trees. Beneath the largest oak in the park, on an old wooden bench, sat a man who needed no introduction, Chuck Norris. Dressed in his signature denim shirt and cowboy hat, he quietly tossed breadcrumbs to the pigeons from a small paper bag. His presence, it commanded respect without ever asking for it. His calm, steady demeanor stood in sharp contrast to the lively park around him. But peace, it never lasts long, not when pride and power collide. Officer Thompson was on patrol that day, his polished boots grinding against the gravel with every determined step. Around here, people knew him as the park tyrant, a man who turned a simple park patrol job into his own personal kingdom. And when Thompson spotted Chuck sitting there, a smug grin spread across his face. He had no idea the next choice he made would change his life forever. What Officer Thompson didn't realize was that his reputation had already caught up with him. Just that morning, 3 different families had filed complaints about his aggressive behavior. An elderly woman, she claimed he threatened to arrest her for feeding the ducks. A young father, he said Thompson forced his kids off the playground for being too loud. The badge on his chest and the ever-growing chip on his shoulder made him feel untouchable. Thompson had joined the park police force 5 years ago, after failing to make the cut as a regular police officer. His instructors at the academy, they'd already noticed his troubling tendency toward excessive authority, a polite way of saying he enjoyed pushing people around. But here, in the park, he'd found the perfect playground for his petty power trips. As he strode toward Chuck's bench, his hand rested lightly on his baton. The afternoon sun reflected off his badge, sending sharp flashes of light across the park. A group of teenagers nearby lowered their phones, sensing something was about to go down. A young mother quickly gathered her kids, recognizing that same swaggering walk Thompson had when he ruined their birthday picnic just last month. Chuck. He kept feeding the pigeons, seemingly unbothered by the approaching storm. But for those who looked closely, there was something in his eyes, a quiet awareness, the kind only a martial artist has when they sense an opponent's first move before it even happens. Thompson stopped directly in front of Chuck, intentionally casting his shadow over him. The pigeons scattered, but Chuck remained still, his weathered hands holding the last few breadcrumbs. What happened next? It would become a story told in this park for generations. Clearing his throat dramatically, Thompson waited. But Chuck, he didn't even look up. "Sir," Thompson barked, dragging out the word with mocked politeness, "this bench is for active park use only. No loitering." Chuck slowly lifted his gaze, locking eyes with Thompson. "I'm not loitering, officer," he said calmly. "I'm actively feeding these birds, and they seem pretty active to me." He gestured to the pigeons, still hopping around enthusiastically. Thompson's face reddened. "Don't get smart with me, old man," he snapped. "You think this is funny?" "No, sir," Chuck replied, unshaken. "But these birds might. They're the only ones here getting fed up." A few onlookers chuckled, which only made Thompson's frustration grow. "Listen here," Thompson leaned in, trying to be intimidating. "I don't care who you think you are. When I give an order, people follow it." Chuck simply adjusted his cowboy hat. "You know, officer," he said smoothly, "I've found that people who have to tell others how important they are usually aren't." By now, the crowd had grown. Phones were out, recording every moment. Someone whispered, "Is that really him?" Another voice answered, "That cop has no idea who he's messing with." Thompson's patience snapped. His grip tightened around his baton. "Final warning," he growled. "Move. Now." Chuck calmly reached into his paper bag and pulled out another handful of breadcrumbs. "Officer," he said, his voice steady, "I respect the law. But right now, the only thing disturbing the peace in this park is your attitude." Thompson's face flushed, red, then purple. He'd never been openly challenged like this before, especially not with such calm confidence. This quiet defiance, it was worse than any shouting match he'd ever had. His grip on the baton tightened. Then, snap, he yanked it free. "Stand up. Now." Chuck remained seated, his tone gentle. "You might want to reconsider that," he warned. "Not for my sake. For yours." Thompson swung his baton, aiming for Chuck's shoulder, a move he'd used countless times to assert dominance. But this time, different. Without seeming to move at all, Chuck's hand shot up, catching the baton mid-swing. He held it firmly. Thompson tried pulling it free, but couldn't. "What the—" "Let go," Thompson stammered, his face burning with humiliation. Chuck remained calm, still holding the baton. "Son," he said, his voice steady, "there are 3 things you need to know right now. First, that badge. It gives you responsibility, not power. Second, I've spent more time training in martial arts than you've spent alive. And third," he released the baton with a slight smirk, "you really should have Googled me before you started this." A teenager in the crowd shouted, "That's Chuck Norris, man. He's a legend." Thompson's embarrassment turned to rage. He holstered his baton, then reached for his taser. "On your feet," he barked. "You're under arrest for assaulting an officer." Chuck finally stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "Officer," he said, his voice controlled, "we both know that's not true. Just like we both know there's no law against feeding pigeons in this park." "Shut up," Thompson snapped, his hand shaking as he aimed the taser. "I said, you're under arrest." An older woman in the crowd called out. "Someone call the real police. This has gone too far." Chuck didn't move. His eyes locked on Thompson's. "Young man," he said, voice even, "I've faced down armed terrorists who were calmer than you are right now. Why don't we both take a breath and talk about what's really bothering you?" Thompson's finger tightened on the taser trigger, but something in Chuck's unwavering gaze made Thompson hesitate, and in that split second of doubt, he made the biggest mistake of his career. His hand moved toward his service weapon. The crowd gasped. Thompson drew his gun. Even the birds scattered, leaving behind an eerie silence that hung over the park like a storm cloud. "Last chance." Thompson's voice cracked ever so slightly. "On the ground, old man." "Chuck." He didn't budge. His expression remained calm, but his eyes, they'd changed. There was something different now, like a teacher watching a student about to make a critical mistake. "You know what's interesting about guns, officer?" Chuck's tone was casual, as if they were discussing the weather. "They make people feel powerful. But real power?" He took one step forward. "Real power is knowing when not to use it. Stay back." Thompson's hand shook visibly. "I said stay back." "Or what?" Chuck asked, his voice soft, steady. "You'll shoot an unarmed man? In front of all these witnesses?" For feeding pigeons. A bead of sweat rolled down Thompson's forehead. For all his years of bullying park visitors, he'd never faced someone like this, someone who was completely unafraid of him. I'm not playing around," Thompson stammered. "Neither am I." And then, it happened. Chuck moved so fast, it was nearly impossible to see. 1 second, Thompson was holding a gun. The next, it lay on the ground, disassembled, in pieces. And Chuck. He was standing exactly where he'd been before, as if he'd never moved at all. "How? What did you?" Thompson stared at his empty hand, stunned. 30 years of martial arts," Chuck said matter-of-factly. "But more importantly, 40 years of learning when not to use it." The crowd, silent. Even the children, who had been playing nearby, now stood still, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. "You've got 2 choices now, son," Chuck continued, his voice calm but firm. "You can keep escalating this situation, or you can pause and ask yourself why you felt the need to draw a gun on a man feeding birds." Before Thompson could respond, a commanding voice sliced through the tension. "Thompson, stand down." Immediately, 2 senior officers rushed toward them, hands resting on their holsters. The older one, Captain Martinez, took one look at Chuck and froze. His eyes widened in recognition. "Mr. Norris, sir," Martinez said respectfully. Then, turning to Thompson, his expression hardened. "Officer Thompson," he said sharply, "what in God's name do you think you're doing?" Thompson frantically pointed at Chuck. He assaulted me. He grabbed my weapon. After you pulled it on me, for feeding pigeons," Chuck added mildly. "Don't forget that part." Martinez's gaze shifted to the disassembled gun on the ground, then back to Thompson. "You drew your weapon over bird feeding?" He wouldn't comply. Thompson's voice had risen to a near squeak. "He was loitering." "Loitering?" Martinez cut him off. "That's not even a valid citation in this park. We've talked about this, Thompson, multiple times." The second officer, Johnson, was already gathering statements from the crowd. "Sir," Johnson called to Martinez, "I've got at least 12 witnesses saying Officer Thompson escalated the situation without cause, plus about 20 videos. And sir," he gestured toward Chuck, "it's Chuck Norris." "For heaven's sake." Martinez rubbed his temples. "The man's trained half the law enforcement in Texas," he muttered under his breath. Thompson's face? It had gone from red to pale. I didn't know." Martinez held out his hand. "Badge and gun. Right now." As Thompson slowly unpinned his badge, Chuck spoke up. "Captain, if I might have a word." Martinez turned to Chuck, his expression respectful. "Of course, sir." Chuck studied Thompson for a moment. "I don't think your officer here is a bad person," he said thoughtfully. "Just someone who's lost his way." By now, the crowd had doubled in size, people filming, whispering. Some were already posting the videos online, their excited chatter filling the air. "Lost his way?" Thompson scoffed weakly. "You don't know anything about me." Chuck's gaze didn't waver. "I know more than you think," he replied. "I see a man who probably dreamed of making a difference when he first put on that uniform. But somewhere along the way, you started confusing respect with fear." A few people in the crowd nodded. Then, an elderly woman stepped forward. "He threatened to arrest my grandson last week," she said, her voice firm, "for skateboarding. And my kids," another parent added, "for laughing too loud." Thompson's shoulders slumped. As more and more stories poured in, his confidence drained, the reality of his actions finally sinking in. The thing about fear, son, Chuck continued, his voice carrying across the now silent park, is that it's like a boomerang. You use it against others. Eventually, it comes back to you. I saw it, Chuck said, eyes locked on Thompson's. In your face. When you pulled that gun. You were scared. I wasn't scared, Thompson muttered. But his voice lacked conviction. Everyone gets scared, Chuck said. The brave ones admit it. The wise ones learn from it. Captain Martinez had been watching this exchange closely, expecting a disaster. Instead, he was witnessing something entirely different. A moment of transformation. Chuck turned to Martinez. You know, he said, in all my years teaching martial arts, I've seen this before. The most aggressive students, sometimes, they become the best ones. Thompson looked up, surprised. What are you saying? I'm talking about second chances, Chuck said. Captain, what if, instead of firing him, Officer Thompson went through training? Some martial arts for discipline, some community service, to reconnect with the people he's supposed to protect. Martinez considered this. Mr. Norris, he began, after what he just pulled. I know, Chuck interrupted gently. But